Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Triasta's webinar on the subject of the process approach to ISO 9001 2015 certification. It's a great pleasure to be able to provide this webinar for you this morning and in celebration of World Quality Day. Just to let you know, we have it's a very popular webinar. We have well over 100 registrants, so we've decided on this occasion to mute participants' phones, but we can and would encourage you to ask your questions using the GoToWebinar control panel that will be visible to you. Any questions we can't get through during the webinar, at the answer session at the end, I will follow up by email personally. We're planning this morning to spend 40 minutes together going through the subject matter, roughly speaking 30 minutes of delivered content and then 10 minutes of questions. It's obviously a big topic. There's an awful lot to get through, and what we're trying to do here is point out resources that are available to you, so that you can, in your own time following the webinar, read in detail some of the subject matter. And what we'll do in the 30 minutes that we have is try and highlight some of the major topics and explore some of the more significant points that we feel are relevant to this process approach. Just to introduce myself, my name is Michael Cousins. I'm the founder of Triasta. Triasta has been in business now for just over 20 years. Since day one, really, we've been a pure play process improvement company. We spend our day-to-day lives helping clients document their processes, improve their processes, or incorporate their processes into a management system of one form or another, whether it be quality or business management system. We also supply tools and services in support of our clients, and we work across the world in large and small organisations, all basically trying to tackle this issue of the appropriate documentation to support QMSs and support the staff in their companies. We're available through the standard social media channels, as you can see here, and please feel free to connect with us on any one of them if you wish to. Okay, so to cover off the agenda for today, we're going to cover three main topics. First off, what does the ISO 9001 2015 process approach principle for QMSs really mean? And what I'm hoping to do in that is dig down very much into what the concept of a process is, have a little look at its history and the context in which we find ourselves today, and pull out a few principles that will be of use to you immediately following the webinar, in fact. We'll then go on and talk about process mapping and how that should be about addressing risk and predicting the results of change. Again, these are words that would be taken from documentation that I'll supply during the webinar for you. And we'll finish off with some practical advice, practical steps in how you can take a process approach in achieving your certification. Okay, so to begin with, let's address this question of what does the ISO 9001 2015 process approach principle for quality management systems really mean? The place I'd like to start is with a quote from a document that we shall look at in a moment. The significance of this quote is really that the process approach is universally applicable. It's a tried and tested method. It's a proven method that can go across businesses, large or small, across the world. So it doesn't matter what country you're in, what culture you have. It doesn't matter what size of organisation you are, or indeed what your core business is. The process approach is useful and can be used across the world. And the reason for this is every organisation is a set of processes. It can be modelled or thought of as a set of interactions between trigger points and delivery points. So customer orders to customer delivery, supplier invoices to supplier payment, etc. It doesn't matter what your organisation is, it can be modelled as a set of processes, and that's why the process approach is applicable across every organisation. I'm going to link now to this document, and as I explained earlier, any documents that I look at here, they'll be available in the public domain, and they are you'll be surprised with the slides following the webinar where you can look at these documents in detail. We particularly like this one. It's published by the International Organization for Standardization, and it describes the process approach in 9001-2015. The URL is available here, and this is available also from the slides that we'll follow up with later. Okay, so that quote was taken directly from that document. The process approach is not new. In fact, the term process has been in use for decades. Deming said, if you can't describe what you're doing as a process, you don't know what you're doing. I don't know the exact date he said that, but it would have been in the 60s and 70s probably. So, you know, 50 or so years ago. So the term process has been in use for a long time, but it's come into common usage and widespread usage very much so in the last decade or so. And I'd like to explore with you the context for this, the historical context. So if you go back to when Deming did say that, many of the tools that we take for granted today simply didn't exist. We've been privileged to live through an industrial revolution in many ways in IT, the miniaturization of the hardware and the explosion of the software tools that are available have really, in many ways, changed the world. So no internet, no iPhone, there were no desktop diagramming packages that we're familiar with today. In fact, there were no desktops. Things like Microsoft Office, email, Google, tools that we use day in, day out that we really take for granted now did not exist when Deming said, if you don't know what you're doing as a process, you don't know what you're doing. And then what happened is, well, the QMSs that were put together in those times. Here's a representation of one such. Very paper intensive, very difficult to produce and maintain. Quality managers would need to be experts in dealing with, you know, paper management, the distribution and communication of paper management. So updating a QMS would have involved communicating through snail mail. So, you know, the big brown envelope, you would put the change notification in, it would circulate around the business and then arrive back in the QMS office. The office itself would have been lever arch files, 6 feet wide and 3 feet high. And if you wanted to access the information in those files, you'd have to go and dig your way through the paperwork to get the content that you wanted. Very difficult to access, very difficult to change, and very difficult to keep up to date and to communicate to the staff, to the consumers of the content. We then, in the early 90s and the late 80s, saw an emergence of technology that would allow us to change the way these things were done. So email came out. This is a way of instantly communicating to thousands of people that something has changed. Desktop diagramming packages emerged. This allowed us to draw flows instead of describe things as a sequence of bullets. We saw the internet and the intranet as tools that would enable us to publish information and broadcast it instantly to a whole organization. So these technology enablers emerged in the 80s and the 90s. And at the same time, forward-thinking organizations were considering how they could remodel themselves to be much more efficient and to provide much better service to customers. So I've just got a couple of examples here. I think of First Direct. I think it's one of, if not the first bank in the UK to offer phone-based banking. A complete transformation there. We could ring the bank anytime, day or night, receive mortgage approval in principle in 15 minutes. We could do all of our normal business with a bank over the phone that previously we would have had to go into a branch to do. Michael Dell came along and transformed the hardware supply industry. Prior to Dell, you would have gone into a shop to purchase a PC. That's almost unheard of these days. The disadvantage of that is that the PC has probably been on the shelf for several months already, absorbing inventory costs and the hardware growing obsolete literally by the day. When Michael Dell came along, he reorganized or re-engineered the whole process of supplies of PCs and said, we won't build the PC until you place the order. So an absolute transformation there. For the first time ever, a PC manufacturer was actually being paid before they'd even purchased the components of the product. So there was massive wide-scale change taking place there. And a couple of authors at the time, Hammer and Champy, wrote this book in 1994, and they described in a lot more detail and using case studies how the process re-engineering concepts were being exploited by organizations, and they were delivering wide-scale change and massive improvements to their business. And it was a very exciting time, actually. So we saw the emergence of technology enablers, we saw the emergence of forward-thinking businesses that were re-engineering their processes as almost early adopters of the process approach. And then ISO adopted the whole thing itself shortly after. Okay, what I'd now like to do is just explore with you a little bit more about this process approach. Let's get down into the nitty-gritty of this, and to do so, I'm going to use a couple of tools here. The first thing I'm going to use is one of the technology enablers that we've just been speaking about. I'm going to go into Google and Google ISO definition of a process. That's where I'd like to start. So the word process is defined in ISO 9001 clause 3.4.1 as a set of interrelated or interacting activities that transforms its inputs into its outputs. Very important definition, this, and it's something that Triastra has built its entire approach on. We actually built our whole approach on this basic core definition. To give you an example of that, I've just loaded up a process library. This is available off of Triastra's website, and again, the links will be available for you. So a process library is just a repository of all of the process content that you may be working with, forms, documents, procedures, and so on. And I'm just going to quickly show you a couple of examples of how you might use that definition in the documentation of your own processes. So let's take this one, for example, recruitment of an employee. And what this enables you to do is see how the definition, if I just flip back quickly again to that definition, so we're dealing with activities that transform inputs into outputs. So here we have an input, which is a vacant position, and if I look to the other side of the process map, we have an output, which is the hired employee. The interacting activities are the white boxes in the middle. And you'll observe that these are used, we have used verbs when we're describing these activities. So initiate, draft the shortlist, select a candidate. Whereas the shaded boxes are all described using nouns. So the first interview shortlist, the new employee hired, the approved recruitment brief. So kind of principle number one, if you like, or takeaway number one is whatever you're using to document processes, if you're going down the process approach, separate very clearly in your documentation the activities in the definition here from the inputs and the outputs. And in that separation, describe your activities always with a verb, and describe your inputs and outputs always with a noun. If you adopt that basic discipline, you'll very quickly find this opens up avenues of analysis for you that previously would have been a little bit blurred. I'll just take a couple of very quick examples. Let me drill down on this draft the shortlist here. So again, we're back into exactly the same type of thing. This is just a more detailed process. It's structured identically. There's an input, there's an output, and there's a sequence of activities. But you'll notice that we now have a job role described. So the HR administrator is the person who is responsible for performing that activity. We wouldn't associate outputs or inputs with responsible concepts. We're much more interested in templates and who owns the template and that type of thing with these objects. But for the activities, the things people do, we are interested in who does them. We're also very interested in costs, obviously, time, effort. Most of the focus on the process approach, or a lot of the focus, comes from not how do I document my current process, but how do I improve it. In order to improve a process, we really need to understand how long it takes, how much it costs, and so on. So in your diagrams, once you've separated your activities from your inputs and outputs, you're able to explore the activities from a business analysis perspective. And I'm just throwing up a couple of attributes here that most people tend to focus on. So costs, resources, time, risk, and so on. We'll look at risk in a bit more detail shortly. These are things that will help you get value from your process documentation above and beyond the simple description of the process. And these are important principles of the process approach, all built off the separation from activity from deliverable, as we refer to them, from inputs to outputs. Okay, if I now just go back to my slides again for a second. What I'd like to explore with you now is the second component of the agenda, which is how process mapping can and should be about addressing risk and predicting the results of change. So we've just had a brief look at a process map. A process map is structured with inputs on the left, outputs to the right, and a sequence of activities in the middle that transform those inputs into those outputs. Risks occur during those processes. Things go wrong, and very much encouraged in the standard to take a risk-based approach to managing these things. And there's a couple of resources I'd like to highlight for you. First off, we're going to deal here with a risk matrix. So I personally favour this model very highly. A very simple model where you have a 1 to 5 score of likelihood of occurrence or probability, and a 1 to 5 score of the impact. So something that happens frequently with a high impact would score 25. Something that happens very infrequently with minimal impact would score 1. And then you have the issue then of how you address and manage the higher risk areas of your business. To help you out with this, we have a resource which I'd just like to point out for you. So let's come back into a browser again. And the easiest way to get to this resource is through Triesta's website. And if you come onto the blog section, we have a rich and growing body of blogs that are constantly being updated. And I'm just going to search on the term risk. And the third article there is the one that I've taken a snapshot of. This was produced by Terry Giles, one of our long-standing and business partners, very respected in the field, and this is his analysis of risk, and I think it's well worth a read. In terms of, again, of obtaining the certification, this type of approach will help you enormously. Terry also goes on to say not just how you identify the risks, but how you can then manage the risks. In other words, what you do about them. These can all be driven from attributes in your processes. So if quickly go back to the process again, you'll notice if I open up the properties tab on any of these objects, we have a risk score attribute here, which is the multiple of the two. You can even take it a little bit more simply. You'll notice on this diagram we have green, amber, or red outlining, and they are high, medium, and low risk respectively. So if we take an attribute view again, beg your pardon, let me just go back to that. If we take an attribute view of that particular map, we can see that there's a very simple risk level that's described using words. So it's entirely your choice as to how you model these things. But I actually personally favour the 5x5 matrix. The second aspect is predicting change. So if I just flick back to my PowerPoint again, what we're concerned with in predicting change is that we've got some understanding of the performance characteristics of our current process. Let's call it the as-is. So we might know how much it costs, how long it takes, how much effort is involved, and so on. What we'd like to be able to do is, in the computer, model the to-be or the possible future states. So we might, for example, be looking to automate part of an engineering process. If we were to do so, we'd expect the total time to reduce because it would be faster. We'd expect reliability to improve, perhaps. We can model these things in the different flows. So when you create your current state process maps, you can then use those process maps to create future states. And instead of the need to go and actually do it for real inside your business, which is costly and fraught with risk, you're able to do it safely inside the computer and let the computer run through thousands of instances of each of these processes and and come up with the statistics that you can use to support your business case for change. So typical things that you'll be dealing with are cost, time, and effort. We often see Lean Six Sigma gets introduced in terms of understanding change and how to respond to it. So the key thing, and I believe in Six Sigma, is that you change your processes so that you add value. And the process cycle efficiency is a key metric that I'd encourage you to read up on, which is the proportion of value-added tasks in your processes. So ideally, you would want that to go up every time you introduce change. Not necessarily, but ideally. And again, an important tool here inside the process approach. Okay. The practical steps in taking a process approach and achieving ISO 9001:2015 certification. There are, shelves full of books written on this topic. So we'll do our best to highlight a few of the things that matter most, and point you to a few more resources. One of my absolute favourite resources right now is this competency framework produced by the CQI. So again, I'm just going to click the link here and go into the web page. Whether I'm sorry, I'm not certain myself, because I'm a member of the CQI. I don't know how this website works if you're not a member, but I would strongly encourage you to take a look if you are. The framework is a fantastic tool. A lot of time was spent developing it, and encourage your organisation to adopt this framework, because it makes a whole load of sense, and it's actually moving the industry, the quality profession is moving forward these days, very much more so into the world of sustainability and improvement, as distinct from defect detection that we might have associated it with in the early days, or defect prevention. This framework is a very useful framework, and I would strongly encourage you to take a look at that. The second thing that I'd just draw your attention to is this document here, ISO 9001:2015 and how to use it. One of the quotes from that document we've reproduced for you here as a tip from the ISO. Identify your organization's key processes. I think that the main word in that sentence actually is key. It's vital that you don't try and do everything. Let's start with the processes that matter the most, the key ones. And from my personal perspective, I would encourage you to focus on the ones that are at the customer interface. So the key processes are the ones that matter most to your customers. Then within each of these processes, make sure you understand the customer's requirements and can guarantee that they're met each and every time. And that should form the basis of your quality management system. So let's just take a look at this article, and again, very valuable article, only 9 or so pages, lot of useful content. You'll see here that we've lifted in my own slides some of the comments and quotes that they've been using in here. It takes you through the principles, quality management principles, and practical advice on how to get started. So as a resource, I think that's an excellent one, and well worth a look. Okay. In my own words, I just strongly encourage that any work you do around the process approach, this notion of the customer interface, that you really surface it strongly. It's much better, I think, given that we all have limitations on time and what we can achieve. If you're doing anything around process, the place to start is with customers. If you do decide to extend past customers, that's fine, but it's probably better always to have as a minimum set the processes that your customers are in the worst case the victims of, or in the best case that the beneficiaries of. So define the process goals according to your customers' needs, and design the processes so they meet those goals. In my personal view, First Direct is a great example of that. That when they sat down and rethought about what the customers needed, they realized customers did not want to go to branches anymore in the branch opening times. What they really needed was to be able to sit at home and do this thing over the phone. And it was a bit of genius, I think, that led to the First Direct being incorporated. in terms of basics, the quality management system must meet these criteria that we've listed here. And again, this is taken from this document. So what I'm going to do in the time available is just spend a few minutes looking again at slightly more detail at this document. But we've highlighted 4 of the contents of that document that we think are really most important. So let me load this for you again, and we'll just have a more detailed run through here. So towards the end of this document, you'll see that there's a tabulation in the appendix, and the items that I've highlighted define the context of the organization, determine the processes in the organization. There's a nice description in this document that will give you a bit more detail, something for you to be able to pick up on after the webinar and you know, start to move forward in these areas if you haven't done so already. Clearly, for Triasta's perspective, because we're a process improvement company, the elements of the standard that we work with the most and that appeal to us the most are all to do with the processes, and the capture of the processes, the improvement of the processes, and the communication of them. But clearly, there's a whole load of other things that are relevant around leadership, risk management, and so on. The one thing I personally favour very heavily in all of this as well is this Plan, Do, Check, Act. So it's been around for an awful long time, but around any kind of implementation of standards or improvement projects, if you do nothing else, to Plan, Do, Check, Act the whole life cycle of improvement will really help you move forward. One's constantly testing assumptions in business. So we assume that if an investment is made in a certain area, it will lead to a certain benefit. And the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle is a great tool to enable you to check your assumptions and constantly check the validity of your planning assumptions. Okay, so in summary, the deadline for transition is September 2008. So if you haven't yet started the work on going for the new standard, please do start it quickly. Time will run out faster than you think. The process approach means many things, but part of what it means is establishing the processes you have in your organization and get them to operate as an integrated and complete system. So here we need to think of our processes not as just a diagrammatic flow of activities, but as a multidimensional, rich body of documentation that incorporates your organization's roles and responsibilities, that incorporates the metrics that you're working with, that incorporates the risks that you're dealing with, and all the working documents, the forms and procedures. That should all be an aspect of your process library, and these are all parts of the process approach. When dealing with risks, these really do now to be addressed by the management system. So one way or another, try and model risk in your business and report and identify risks. A simple tool of doing this is using, in whatever process approach you use, there will be some element of reporting. And if you can get reports out that would give you things like risk analysis, or even correlation with your ISO standards. So I particularly like this report. This is pointing out for me the clauses of the standards and where they actually tie in to the processes that we're using. And this is all part and parcel now of auditor expectation on the process approach. Hasten to add, you don't have to document anything, but I've yet to meet or talk with anyone who thought it was a good idea not to do so. So if you are going to document things, getting this metadata level in there is the gift that keeps on giving, because it drives reports and it can drive analysis much more strongly than just the models can alone. If you do this, the benefits really are quite significant. So if I flick back to my PowerPoint again and quickly summarize the benefits. In fact, well, I won't summarize the benefits. The benefits are all actually available in the slides, and they're also available in the documents that I've referenced during the talk. So we picked out quite a few of the benefits here just by way of a summary. And what I'd like to do now, just by way of closure, is point out a few resources, a few additional resources that are available to you. First thing we have is an expert guide to achieving ISO 9001-2015, produced by Mark Braham. Mark Braham was one of the standards writers, so he was involved in the category A liaison, and is really an expert in this, and has produced an article with Triaster that you can be downloaded. I'd encourage you to do that. Very useful resource. The articles that I've been using are also relisted here, and the process library example I've been using is available to you also. That's available off Triaster's website, which can be used through mobile devices as well as on your website. We've got a number of case studies, articles, videos, blogs, all available for free for you. Many of them are associated with the process approach or the challenge of achieving ISO certification. So please do spend time to find those and to look through them. And it just remains for me actually to thank you very warmly for your time this morning. You will be sent a copy of the slides and a link to a recording of this webinar. If you have any questions, and I can see there's quite a few questions coming in, based on the number of questions, I can see already that we won't get through them, but I'll try to get through as many as I can. And I will, as I've said, follow up on where the follow up with written answers if we're not able to get to them. Okay, so I have a question in from Syed. Thank you, Syed. Can you please elaborate on where processes sit within the overall quality management system? Well, interesting phraseology there. I'm not sure that I'm not sure they can be divided in that way. So I don't see them myself as being separate things, one sitting within the other. The process approach and the QMS are one and the same thing in many ways, and generally, certainly with the clients we work with, there is no distinction. So the presumption, the overall presumption is that the processes are an integral component of your QMS, and people think of the process library and the QMS as being the same thing, with links out actually to the procedures. So I guess you could say that the processes are the first port of call, and from the processes one would then link down into the supporting information and procedural documentation. Yeah, I think so. And I'm not sure kind of proportionately how much time or how much of your QMS should be devoted to processes and how much to procedures. We tend to find the more processes you adopt, the fewer procedures are necessary. Excuse me. So there's less documentation required, the more process that you put in the system. Please do follow up, Syed, if that hasn't answered your question, and I'll gladly engage with you on email over that a bit more fully. Okay, let's have a look at the next question here. I have a question in from Emma, and thank you, Emma. Can I have a copy of the ISO paper you referenced? Yes, everything in the webinar is in the public domain, and the slides that I've used will be made available to you, and you'll be able to link to those documents either from the slides or if you review the webinar, you will see that the URLs were visible at the top of the screen. Okay, there's another question in. What feedback do your customers get from auditors of the QMS, from ISO 9001 auditors of the QMS? Okay, well, generally speaking, the feedback is of course very, very positive, because we've adopted the ISO approach. So the approach they recommend is precisely the approach that we deliver. So auditors tend to favour it slightly more strongly than that. We do get warm praise very frequently because it's viewed as best practice, that this separation of noun and verb and the ability to associate, for example, the metadata in the processes with the clauses of the standard. These are things that auditors do tend to like very much. So generally, by and large, the feedback is good. If they do have a grumble, I guess it's only that their fees get reduced because they need to spend less time auditing. But that's in no way a bad thing. So yeah, generally very warm feedback. There's a further question in here from David. Thank you, David. You mentioned some significant benefits of the process approach. What are the downsides? Downsides? I don't think there are any. I think, like anything of value, there clearly has to be an investment of time, an investment of resource and money to adopt the process approach. It requires if it hasn't been done to any extent in your business previously, it requires a mindset change and a culture change, perhaps. And these are all demanding, challenging things to take on. But apart from the fact that the challenge exists and therefore needs to be addressed, I don't think there is a downside that I'm aware of in adopting this. I've yet to see it not work, and I've yet to see it not deliver benefit. So, from my perspective, I think it's a fantastic approach. Can you please show the RACI? Okay, so that was a question in from Simon. Let me very quickly do that. I think what you're referring to there is in the report section. I flash by this report here. Sorry, the RACI analysis. So yeah, so this is the responsibility, accountability, consultant informed, and again, it's driven by metadata. So within any process, you would expect to store information about who is responsible, who is accountable as attributes of those objects. And that enables you in a report of this nature to say, well, okay, if I am, for example, a database analyst, what are the activities for which I'm responsible in this process library? If I'm a business analyst, similarly. And then I would be able from the report to then go and look into the process and see precisely what part I have to play. So in this part, I'm responsible for defining the system scope and so on. So the RACI report stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consulted and Informed, would just drop out of a standard process library. Okay, there are a few more questions, but I'm very conscious of your time today, ladies and gentlemen, and I don't want to go over the agreed time. So what I'll do is I'll draw that to a close now, and as I've said, I will follow up on email with any remaining questions. So thank you very much for your time today, and that ends the webinar. Thank you.